The Dark Side of Projects, Dimensionality, Research Method and Agenda. My name is Giorgio Locatelli, and this video is based on a paper that my co-author and I published in the Project Management Journal in 2022. If you enjoyed this video and you want to learn more about the dark side of projects, you're welcome to download the paper, read it, and if you like, get in contact with us. A link to the paper is in the description. We would like to start explaining the relevance of the dark side of project with a quote taken by the British newspaper The Guardian. More than 6,500 migrant workers from India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka have died in Qatar since it won the right to host the World Cup 10 years ago. In other words, the World Cup project counts with direct and indirect a death toll of 6,500 lives. The cost of project in terms of human life is a topic that we usually don't discuss in project studies. Also, phenomena like modern slavery that explain what is going on with the Qatar World Cup belong to what we call the dark side of project. With our paper, we want to introduce this phenomenon in project studies, present what we know about them, and how can we do further research. There are obvious examples of dark side, such as corruption. The World Economic Forum or Transparency International estimated billions are lost each year to corruption. The actual cost of corruption is comparable to the GDP of a country like Germany. Corruption is relevant in projects. For instance, the Rio Olympics staged numerous corruption and bribery scandals. Another obvious example is modern slavery. We discussed before the example of Qatar 2022 World Cup, where workers are trapped in abusive working conditions, and many thousands of these workers are dying. It is important to remember that we don't have to think about the dark side as something far distant in country that is irrelevant for us. The dark side includes phenomena like sexism or money laundering, which are common worldwide, including the European Union. The dark side is a shade of grey. We saw obvious example of the dark side. We all hopefully agree that 6,500 people dying to organize the World Cup is unacceptable. But what about building infrastructure like a stadium or a ski ramp in the middle of the desert? Is it a waste of public resource and raw material, or is it a good investment to incentivize people to practice a sport and embrace a healthy lifestyle? We can have different opinions about this, which makes the dark side interesting. Similarly, the development and use of management fashion by management gurus can be seen as one livelihood and attempt to share knowledge with a wider public, whereas for others, it might be defined as selling smoke and mirror and intentionally promoting false representation and promises about business practices. Close to project, institutionalizing the education of project managers via a series of certifications that one needs to be awarded might be viewed as a career path that is beneficial for the individual project manager and a safeguard of project practice and the society and communities affected by these projects. However, on the other hand, any paid certification can be seen as a manifestation of market shelter that professional project managers enjoy, which remain exclusionary for those with interest and perhaps talent in the management of projects, but who cannot afford to pay for the certification. The dark side, therefore, is something that is not obvious and can be close to us. For instance, on the 15th January 2018, the BBC highlighted construction giant Carillion has gone into liquidation, threatening thousands of jobs. The fall of Carillion might be a very different phenomenon from the modern slavery in Qatar or the World Cup, but they are both manifestations of the dark side. At the time, Carillion was one of the largest construction companies in Europe, with 43,000 staff worldwide, 20,000 in the United Kingdom, and 20,000 families, in addition to the worker families involved in supply chain, lost their income in a few days. Carillion was involved in several major construction projects and programs. Important needed projects, such as the construction of hospitals, were stopped. So what caused this spectacular disaster? The UK Parliament used a strong word in the slide: Carillion's rise and spectacular fall was a story of recklessness, hubris, and greed. Its business model was a relentless thirst for cash, driven by acquisition, raising debt, expansion to new markets, and exploitation of suppliers. The dark side is therefore wicked, ambiguous, and elusive, and found at the intersection of different notions of morality and ethics, institutional ideologies, and systemic factors that are hard to articulate, grasp, identify, and change. It means that what is a dark side for me, that I'm an ordinary Italian chismail, might not be dark side for someone in Finland or someone in China. And what is a dark side for me with my background might be very different from what is a dark side for other people with other backgrounds or values. Even more interesting is how the dark side changed over time. What is considered the dark side today might not be considered the dark side 100 years ago. Similarly, probably people from 100 years from now will see the dark side of today in a different way. So why should project manager and project scholar bother about this? Well, there are at least two ways to see this. The first one is phenomenological, as the dark side includes several phenomena relevant for project. We discuss corruption, modern slavery, and sexism. This is what keeps project managers awake at night. As a field of study, we want to stress how very few papers in project journal describe the dark side, mostly corruption, while the same topics are far more discussed in other communities. Sexism and gender discrimination are another example that there are few papers in our field and far more papers in other epistemological communities. Our theories are silent on the mechanism underlying such wrongdoings. This topic is problematic, difficult to study, and should be more central to our research and teaching practice. Project study need to be awaked to project dark side. As project study community, we have failed to shed light on the dark side and therefore have failed to provide a clear understanding of the conditions under which our projects are being built, sometimes at the expense of human life. We believe it is time to change this. Even though the theory of the dark side of projects is silent, the project management literature has started documenting the different type of professional irresponsibility that this phenomenon can lead to. So we can have political irresponsibility where project managers are unaware of the political factor influencing their project and end up prioritizing some stakeholder over other. Equally rightful stakeholder, we can have intellectual irresponsibility where project managers who only have one way of doing things and manage their project and cannot tailor solution to problem and find the appropriate approach to do that particular project. And we have morally responsibility where project manager cannot tell the difference between what is right and wrong and end up supporting unethical practice without being fully aware of the difference. So what is the dark side anyway? For our context, there is no clear definition of dark side in the literature. Our definition is that the dark side involves an illegal or unethical phenomena associated with projects. This is a reasonable definition, but we need to be careful using it, because, for instance, what is legal in one jurisdiction might be illegal in another. So the definition has to be jurisdiction dependent. Morality and ethical standard depends on the context, are ambiguous and subjective. So you might find something morally acceptable in context A and not acceptable in context B. Sometimes even if they are inside the same country. Both legal and moral standards are dynamic. What is legal and ethical today might not be legal and ethical 50 years from now, and vice versa. So we need to be careful when we use the definition and bound it to the context and time which are relevant. We can even try to put a minimum standard. So is the 948 United Nations Universal Human Rights Declaration a minimum standard? Well, we have to be careful with that because we truly believe that this is the minimum standard that we should have. Yet, we need to acknowledge, as the author of this paper comes from a culture and country that signed that declaration. So this declaration is consistent with our value. However, not Every country has signed the Declaration of Human Rights. Many countries didn't sign the declaration even today. So we need to be careful, because we risk discriminating against those people that would not endorse our system of value, and probably are the same people who are in the contest that mostly suffer from the dark side. Therefore, we believe that the framework in this slide, which is also in our paper, can help. We believe it is important to distinguish between international and local practices. And we have this framework with one axis on the phenomenological and the legal aspect at international or local, another axis if the phenomenon is legal or ethical acceptance and international or local standards. So when something is illegal and unethical from an international and local perspective, that's dark side, for instance bribery. But we can have a situation where something is illegally local but legally and internationally, and vice versa. These are controversial phenomena, and we can tell them a gray element of the dark side, and need to be considered extremely carefully. We move now to the literature. So when we look at the literature on the dark side in Project Journal, we find that the most covered topic is corruption. There are around 10 to 12 papers regarding corruption in project study. Still, significant research is needed. For instance, we know very little about anti-corruption in project. For instance, we don't know how can deliver a project in a corrupt context. What we also cover is sexism with 3 articles, which is an extremely important aspect of the dark side because women are underrepresented in project-based industry, particularly in managerial roles. Therefore, there is a huge scope for more research in sexism. Some topics are worth exploring because they are empirically relevant and we have no research in project studies. For instance, a conflict of interest, money laundering, modern slavery, organizational and project power, politics, and so forth. It is worth saying that those topics might not be investigated in project studies, but investigated in other communities, even in the context of project. Let's take, for instance, modern slavery. Modern slavery is not present at this moment in project studies journal, but is discussed in larger journal, which publish paper on modern slavery even in the context of projects, for instance, in the construction sector. We acknowledge that studying the dark side is difficult. There are topics which are easier to discuss and collect data. For instance, if you want to study which risk management certification are employed in project-based organization, that's relatively straightforward. It's a topic that you can easily collect primary data and secondary data, since it's not an issue to discuss. Obviously, if you want to research corruption, modern slavery, sexism, data collection and publication is far more difficult. The good news is that our paper explains how it is possible to do research in this context. So first, we need to consider that there are issues. When scholars investigate the dark side, they could be exposed to physical risk, where the people who look at this got murder, liable to be sued for slander, and emotional reaction connected with this topic. For instance, studying modern slavery has a different emotional implication than studying earned value or project budget. So we have 3 suggestions for the way forward. You need to be rigorous and knowledgeable during the research project. Learn the literature well, learn about the research method, know what you're doing, and learn the context. So if you're doing this research in the context of country A, at least one of the research should be an expert in country A, particularly regarding its legal and ethical aspect. We strongly recommend asking someone with a low background to support the research, or at the very least to review the writing of your paper. Probably in your university you have people in the legal department that can help you with that. Data are difficult to obtain. People in organizations do not feel comfortable speaking and sharing data about the dark side. Data trustworthiness can be questionable and difficult to verify. We provide 2 suggestions. Use more secondary data. For instance, if you download the Panama paper, gigabytes of data are available for research. Second, take a positive perspective. So instead of asking, does your company use modern slavery, you can ask which are the policies in your company to prevent your subcontractor from using modern slavery. There is an ethical dimension in doing this kind of research. Data might not be publishable because of confidential information. So we suggest you look for interdisciplinary collaboration. So for instance, if you're studying money laundering and you're not an expert on money laundering, you should start reading a dedicated journal like Journal of Money Laundering and Control, and ideally get in contact with the authors of the paper in that journal. From them, you can learn how to research this particular topic. Try to use information from relevant sources, so secondary data from juridical case, parliamentary inquiry, and be conservative when you write. For instance, until a person is proven guilty, any consideration is alleged, and this should be said explicitly all the time. So conclusion, the dark side of project is a relevant phenomenon with multiple dimensions in terms of modern slavery, in terms of corruption, in terms of money laundering. It is ambiguous, is evolutionary, is socially constructed, is subjective. There are many different perspectives on this phenomenon. This perspective will change over time, over the country, over the context. The dark side is a field of study which is underdeveloped, particularly in the context of project and temporary organization. And is a field of study that needs special care and skills because there are risks in doing research. The topic is of extreme interest. It is also a topic of a special issue published in the Project Management Journal, and we have an open collection in Project Management Journal about the dark side. So anytime you would like to submit a paper about the dark side, you can get in contact with myself, Giorgio Locatelli, or Dr. Joanna Gerardi. We will be happy to help you to shape your paper. This is what we wanted to tell you about our paper. You are welcome now to download the paper, read it, reflect on it, and get in contact for any feedback. You're also welcome to get in contact if you want us to help you to develop your research on the dark side. Thank you for your time in listening to this video and reading our paper.